Remain standing and we'll read from Galatians chapter 6. Don't be weary in well-doing. That's what we're about to read. Galatians 6, let's read together. Don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their only sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So let us not get tired of doing what is good. At just the right time, we will reap a harvest of blessing if we don't give up. Therefore, whenever we have the opportunity, we should do good to everyone, especially to those in the family of faith. This is the word of the Lord. Amen. And you may be seated. As I was reading this again this morning, this passage, I was thinking many people probably have not heard. Andre Crouch actually wrote a song about this very early in his career, and I doubt that the recording is out there anymore. But I remember hearing it as a young adult. Let us not be weary doing what is right, for after a while we shall receive a harvest of blessing if we don't get discouraged and if we don't give up. So the song, I think, was called Just Keep Holding On. I want to just talk to you this morning about the blessing of ordinary time. And I've had a lot of fun just kind of putting this message together and thinking about it through the week. And I want to base my points of my message on Galatians 6. And the 3 points that I will use today is what we sow, we will also reap. Secondly, not to be weary in doing good. And third, we will reap if we don't lose heart. And I just want to talk to you about that this morning a little bit. But what really first caught my eye about this sermon and where I really began was a reading today from Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is kind of complaining or giving a report about his life. The reason that he is not in a really good mood, kind of in a sour mood, is because they have put him in up to his armpits. In the King James Version says mire. It's really just, it's an outhouse where the outhouse has moved on, but what was left from the outhouse is still there. And they put him down there in his armpits. It's not a favorable situation for anybody to be in. And he decides, the reason they put him there is interesting because Jeremiah was not a popular preacher. Jeremiah actually was one of the least popular speakers of his time. All the prophets of his era were really doing better than he was. People went to hear them. They enjoyed hearing them because the other guys were talking about the favor of God is upon our country. He will never let our country down. Our nation is going to prosper no matter what. All the enemies will be defeated and we're going to be victorious. The Lord is in his temple. He won't allow his temple to be destroyed. And so these prophets are just prophesying these wonderful, glorious, uplifting kind of sermons. And Jeremiah is coming along saying, no, God has a deeper purpose for all human beings. And he is going to fulfill his reaching those human beings by allowing our nation to go under. The temple is going to be destroyed. Most of you living to me will be dead. Living around me are going to be dead, and your children are going to live in exile, and it's going to be a long time before they're regathered back into this land, and that is the message that I have from God to tell you. Well, nobody wants to hear that, and so they told him, you need to be quiet. You're undermining the morale of the nation, and we're going to do you a world of hurt if you don't shut up. And he continued on, and so they found an effective means of making him promise to be quiet. There is nothing like being up to your armpit in manure to determine that you're going to change your ways. And Jeremiah promises them that I won't say anything more detrimental. I'm going to live my life in peace. I'm going to raise chickens, and I'm going to have a little farm on the edge of town. I'm not going to bother anybody. But then he said as soon as he said, out of that situation, he said it was like fire shut up in my bones, and I could not be silent. So that's Jeremiah's kind of contribution here, and we're going to talk a little bit about him in these 3 points. But I wanted to tell you, I went to the place of kind of personal identification with Jeremiah. Because pastoring can be really difficult, particularly as the years go by. And I have often found myself, and I'm sure a lot of pastors feel the same way, thinking, is anything I'm doing or anything I'm saying doing any good for anybody? Because the truth is, if I take a quiz at the end of the service, what did I say in my sermon? No one will want to take that quiz. And week after week, I know that a great numbers of the audience are going to different places in their head as soon as the sermon begins. It doesn't matter how many hours I have spent preparing for the sermon. It doesn't matter how passionate I feel about the sermon. When I open my mouth, you know, the children tell the truth. They squirm and they begin to just kind of fidget around, and they're oh, because they'll tell you with their body language, I am bored. But adults, those well-mannered adults anyway, will get that glazed look on their eyes of great serenity and blessing, but they're somewhere else. And you can tell they're somewhere else. And so sermons are kind of like putting mud up on the wall. Not very much of it sticks. A little bit may from time to time. An exceptional sermon is exceptional. It's rare. And there is a reason why, I guess, in popular speech, people say, don't sermonize, or don't preach at me, or whatever, because preaching is an art that is difficult to pull off in the sense of bringing people into the message, no matter how much content there may be. Or, you know, it can be quite discouraging. And so the years go by, and you begin to realize, too, most people do not come to church to hear a sermon if they even want to hear a sermon. They don't come to a church to hear a sermon about difficult things. People actually, if I can tell a couple of jokes and an inspiring story, I'm good. A lot of people will say, that's a great sermon. Thank you very much. It's a way of keeping your job over a long period of time, to just keep the people kind of involved. Let me tell you a little story about a puppy. There once was this little puppy, and there was this and then there was a grandma, and she loved the puppy, and you're already into it, see? But when I start talking about Jeremiah, it's like, yeah, you got to say that, I guess, but connect it to the puppy some way, right? And that's kind of the way. So after a while, you can begin to think, it really doesn't matter how much I prepare. No one really cares that much. So why should I? Maybe I should just kind of spin the story about the puppy and shake hands at the end, and people are like, I love that story. Thank you very much. And truly, this is what it appears. Most people, most of the time, will be more than delighted with that. And Jeremiah knew that. And Jeremiah, there is something about when the prophet's angry, the prophet is spewing out, things need to change. They need to change. You're not in a good shape. I'm warning you about things to come. So the prophets, we call it anointing in charismatic circles, but mostly it's just you're mad. And so you're getting this across the best you know how, but there comes a time beyond that to where, okay, why is the preacher so mad? There's something worse than that, and that's when the preacher just quits. He just stops because he knows it's not going to make a difference. That's where Jeremiah was. It doesn't matter. They're not going to listen. Lord, you've given me a message no one wants to hear. I'm done now. And he says, I won't say anything more. So that's where I went, thinking about Jeremiah. Obviously, I'm connecting it to myself. Then I began to think about, that's most people's stories. We all are working in things that God has given us, perhaps, that have long seasons of tedium, to where we're not sure that anything we're doing is making any difference in the world. And we wonder if our life will be of any significance. Or is our finger kind of like in a bowl of water, and when we take the finger out, the water just closes up and no one knows that we were there because we really didn't really do anything of significance. And especially this week, I was mindful because my daughter Talitha is here with us today and my 2 grandsons, and I don't think my granddaughter is here. She skipped out today. She's with her cousins. But my daughter Talitha is here with her 2 little boys. One of them is just over a year old and the other one is just 2 months old. And they're a delight and a joy, and also a handful. My wife and I and Talitha, all 3, have been juggling these little boys morning and up in the night, and my daughter, of course, at night, because there's things that the little one needs that neither me nor my wife can do for the child. And so, as I began to notice, the weariness of my daughter, Talitha. And then I began to think about Tiffany, who also lived with us with the little children when they were little, and just thinking about how much time that our mothers and all of you that have been mothers, fathers too, but particularly the mothers that are just giving years and years of your life away and wondering if it's making any difference. Anything you're doing is really going into these children, and is it going to make a difference? Or have you given your life away for nothing? And is there nothing that comes back to you for these many years of just doing what is right day after day after day? And so this message, the blessings of ordinary time, we've got green up, and that is the color of ordinary time. And the reason is that's when things are growing. The church year begins with Advent, and then it goes all the way to Pentecost, which is somewhere about, right after Thanksgiving. We start into Advent, and then it goes all the way up to Pentecost, which was just a few weeks ago. And then we go to the second half of the year in which there is no real Christian holiday at all. Just one Sunday after another. So there's no Christmas trees. There's no nativity scene. Or there is no passion play. Or there is no Holy Week. Or there's nothing preparing for Pentecost. There is nothing in terms of big themes. So what is ordinary time about? Ordinary time is the time of waiting and the time of gestation. We have put the seeds in the ground. If we're turning back to a farmer metaphor here. Putting seed in the ground, and then what do? You're waiting, you're weeding, perhaps if the weeds, making sure the weeds are not choking out the seeds, but you cannot see what's under the ground. You have to trust that things are going to be well and that there will be a harvest time to come. And that is what Galatians 6 is taking this metaphor and reminding us, whatever you sow, you're going to reap. So be careful what you sow. Secondly, don't be weary in doing what is good during the season of gestation. And third, we're going to reap if we don't lose heart. Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations. It may be one of the least read books of the Bible. It is one of the books we rarely preach about because it starts off saying how solitary sits the city who once was full of life. The voice of the children are no more heard. They have filled in the wells. In other words, his prophecies have come to pass now. And he's talking about the devastation and the burnt things and how there is no children around, that it just old people and folks that were not in good enough health to take away to captivity to work the fields of the conquerors. And he's in despair. And he's just writing just this dirge that's just chapter after chapter. And by the way, if you don't have any kind of hymns or poetry or scripture in your life for the difficult times, then your religion is somehow inadequate for all of life. We all like the more bouncy, happy, clappy, yay, hooray kinds of things. Everybody does. Everybody prefers a party to a funeral. Everybody prefers a season of flourishing and delight to a season that's difficult or tedious. But Jeremiah wrote the book of Lamentations because in life sometimes there are things to lament, and we need that. But in the middle of the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah wrote something that you may have heard before. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, and his mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. He didn't write that when the money was flowing in and when everything was prosperous and everything was wonderful. He wrote it in the midst of a lament. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. He was reaping, he was sowing something even in the midst of the difficult times. At the conclusion of this message, we will receive communion. And I read just yesterday in a book I was reading with someone, it says communion, the table of the Lord, is love turned into food. Week after week, for 2,000 years, Christians gather around the table and they partake of this kind of strange, simple thing of taking in their bodies a little bit of bread, a little bit of wine. And what is it for? And what does it do? Well, it is God's love that we can ingest into our bodies. It is a flowing of life from God into the world through us. And we do that week after week after week after week and century after century after century. Like the family meal. Your family gathers around the table, and you have to work at this. And a lot of people think it's just too much work. So it's better to just watch television and to let everybody grab whatever they want and to eat out of a can or just get whatever they want. And so the family meal takes an awfully lot of energy to make people come together around a table, and people do it less and less, which is why our families, it's one of the reasons our families are not as stable as they should be. The family meal is worth fighting for. Day after day after day after day. And people need to sit down, and they don't need to have their devices around the table. This is not a time to read from the iPad or to look at it. It's a time to come around the table. And why is that? Because it's not just about the chicken or the beans or whatever it is that you've fixed. And it is about the interchange that occurs between the persons around that table as you are gathered. The food is kind of the prop to build a family. And it isn't done all at once. It's done day after day after day after day and week after week after week. And while the kids are growing up complaining, I don't want to say, I want to do this little game. No, you have to fight for it. No, that's going away. That's not coming to the table. We're going to have mashed potatoes, and you're going to actually look at one another. And sometimes there are even disagreements across the table, which doesn't, it's not always pleasant. But a mealtime is making people face one another as persons within family, and it builds up a family. And when you sow that day after day and year after year, you build a family. What we sow, we also reap. The second point is don't be weary in well-doing. Bob Gwaltney died last night at 2 o'clock in the morning. Bob Gwaltney has been a part of this church since the very beginning. And I don't know, his wife Doris died a year or so ago, and he took care of her. And then his own disease returned after many years of remission. And so I went to see him the other day, and some things happened there. Number one, he asked me to pray that the Lord would take him before that he has to be constrained to the bed while he's still walking around. And the Lord answered that prayer. And then, as we just talked about various things, he said, before I get too sick or whatever, I wanted to, and he had his tithes from several weeks that he gave to me to make sure that it was turned into the church. Bob Gwaltney, in flood and hurricanes, well, we don't have hurricanes here, tornadoes, snowstorms, it doesn't matter. Bob Gwaltney has brought his tithe to the church because many times his wife couldn't come, and there was seasons that he wasn't coming because he was taking care of her. But he would come Monday morning to the church and bring his tithes because he felt like that was his responsibility. He was a member of this community, and he wanted to make sure that he was contributing to the lights being on and the salaries being paid and so forth. Now, there's numbers of people in our church that have been here for many, many, many years, and you've never learned that lesson. In fact, there's lots of folks in our church never given anything. So that our lights are just on magically, and you may not be able to. Maybe you're in a place that you can't. Or maybe it's just you've never made it a priority. There is something about when we look into the face and the life of a faithful person, year after year, week after week, just pulling his weight the best way that he knew how. He wasn't weary in doing good. Anybody here seen Mr. Holland's Opus? Isn't it one of the greatest movies of all time? If you haven't seen it, see it today or tomorrow. So Mr. Holland is a music teacher. And he has this ambition. He's not going to teach for long. He's going to write the great American symphony. That's his desire. And that's what he wants to, that is what he has set his heart on doing. But instead, he comes into the music class because he's got to make a living for the family. And he listens to the kids. And he's like, yeah, I think you're doing better, And then the kid, blowing on the horns and so forth. And then he puts it all together, and you watch his face, and it's like, oh, God, help me, deliver me. Because the kids are playing the stuff, and he's directing, and they're like, okay. Here's how you don't make the reed squeak that way, and there's a breathing exercise. Let me show you. Okay, and it's out of pitch. It needs tuned, and he's just doing this all the time. And then at the end of the day, and he goes home and listens to his music, and he writes a little bit on the great American symphony that he's preparing, where he's going to bring the house down with he's going to be another Aaron Copland. He's going to make a mark on the world musically like the world's never seen. And the years go by, and he's just given his years and his frustrations, his personal life. Things aren't going well year after year after year. You see with Mr. Holland, he meets great temptation, but he backs away, and he stays on course. And then they tell him that there's been a downturn in the funding of the educational system. And of course, the first department that must be cut is music, because why does the world need music? Music is something that we can take or leave, so that's the first thing that gets cut. It makes me think about Winston Churchill in the midst of the war fought to keep the budget up for the arts, and somebody in the parliament yelled and said, "Mr. Churchill, we're fighting a war." Yeah, but he says, what are we fighting it for? So the schools cut the budget. Mr. Holland's job is going to be cut. And he doesn't know this, but the school decides to bring everybody together that's ever played before as kids. And we'll deal with that in just for a moment. Jeremiah has to give witness through a very difficult time in his nation's history. This is not a time when he gets to say prosperity is right around the corner. Things are going to be wonderful. You can't believe how great it's going to be. And so, of course, he gets discouraged and he wants to quit. But do you know something that he did? He wrote in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31, he said, "A new day is coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Jacob, the house of Israel, not according to the covenant that they broke." But he said, I'm going to do a new covenant. I'm going to write my laws in their hearts. And this is the very language that the writers of the New Testament take up. It is why we call the New Testament the New Testament. He gives the whole vision of a coming new covenant that God is going to make with his people. And it starts off the very first book of the New Testament, the book of Matthew, begins to say that time has come. The new covenant has come. Jeremiah didn't get to say things are going to be better a year from now. He got to say things are going to be better in the far distant future, but right now we're playing our part for that future to arrive. He didn't get to see all that he hoped, all that he had sowed come to pass. And I don't know if we could say he wasn't weary in well-doing, because there seemed to be a time that when he was so discouraged he just couldn't go on. But nonetheless, he said, as he was up to his armpits in this stuff, and he decided he would quit, once he got out of that situation, he immediately says, I can't stop. It's like fire in my bones. Here's the following point. We will reap if we don't lose heart. How many people have just stopped in the middle or at 2/3 of the way when God had given them something to do? And with that, I'm going to tell a story, and then I've got to get out of the way because we have communion, and I've taken up too much time already. A few years ago, I was in Colorado Springs. It's many years ago, for pastors of larger churches, and we were on this retreat, and they told us, that we could go and walk up into the mountains, and that we had 4 hours to do that, and then they were going to have dinner, and they would ring a bell about half hour or so before dinner. So I walked up in the mountains, but I'm a mountain kid, so I was hoofing it. And I kept going, and I wasn't paying attention that, like, about that 3 hour mark, I was still going, and I got above the tree line. And I could look out. Oh, it was such a beautiful vision. Everywhere I looked, it was just gorgeous as far as the eye could see. It was just absolutely stunningly gorgeous. And then somewhere I heard a ding, 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 ding. And I looked down, and whoa, way down there was that retreat center. And I thought, I've got to get down there. But I took a moment, and I felt like suddenly just the Lord was having me to look around. And I looked at where I was going. One thing, I noticed the path, making sure that I would go in the right path and to the place. And I just took it all in, and just for a few more seconds. And then I immediately went into the woods. And after I had taken, I couldn't have taken 35, 40 steps. I felt the Lord just stop and say, stop just for a moment. And I felt that I should stop. And I looked around to see if there was a snake or something, and it wasn't. And so I was going to go again. And then I realized what the Lord wanted to show me. I couldn't see the vision anymore. I had lost my vision. Or had I? This is the nature of vision. The Lord shows us great and marvelous things, and we see the panoramic view, but then when we start the day-to-day grind, we're down in it, and we have to keep the vision in our head now. And I had to remember that path turns to the right, not to the left, and all those things, and I did make it in time, but the point was, I had to keep that vision in my mind during the tedium of the day-to-day. Jeremiah lived at a time when he was telling them a new covenant is coming and the old is disappearing. And the book of Hebrews takes that up and explains why all that, why things that Jeremiah wouldn't have been able to see on his own. Well, these reflections are kind of autobiographical in a way. looking back on my own life, I see that the Lord has done some things in my life, and I appreciate it. But there have been long stretches of time where I just couldn't see what was being done. And I think that's true of all of us. And instead of just kind of being in a pity party about it, I felt like the Lord would like me to tell you that that's just the nature of life. That sometimes we are doing one thing after the other, day after day after day after day. And we can lose sight of that wonderful vision where we begun. Mr. Holland did have his opus. His great symphony that they put on was not that great. Any musician will tell you, oh, that's kind of okay, but it's nothing spectacular. But in attendance were the people whose lives have been saved and put together and molded through the years by a faithful man, just being a good man. St. Thomas Aquinas says, who is that good man? That good man is that man who, knowing the right thing to do, does that thing day after day after day.